June 15th, 1955, Moscow. A cold, wet day. 15,000 spectators sit wrapped in raincoats and huddled under umbrellas in an outdoor stadium, watching the first athletic competition held solely between the United States and the Soviet Union since World War II. Backstage, a 340-pound man from Toccoa, Georgia, lies on a couch waiting. His name is Paul Anderson. He's 22 years old. Out on the platform, the Soviet champion, Alexey Medvedev, has just matched the Olympic record with a 330-pound press. The crowd is pleased. Their man has performed. The bar is now loaded to 182.5 kilograms, 402.5 pounds, a weight no human being has ever cleaned and pressed overhead. Anderson rises from the couch and walks to the platform. The American newsreel narrator, Bud Palmer, describes the moment. The Russians snickered as Anderson gripped the bar. He is 5'9". He weighs more than the bar and the platform officials combined. His neck alone is wider than most men's thighs. The crowd watches this enormous American waddle forward, and some of them laugh. Then up went the bar. The snickering stopped. Anderson locked it out overhead. The Soviet announcer, audibly shaken, told the crowd, "We rarely have such weights lifted." Anderson had exceeded the existing world record by 10 kilograms. Not edged past it, demolished it. Doug Hepburn's previous mark of 172.5 kilograms wasn't even close. Rain kept falling on the stadium. 15,000 people who'd come to watch their own champions dominate were on their feet. The Russian press would dub Anderson Chudo Prirodi, a wonder of nature. Soviet posters in the sports daily Sovetski Sport identified him as a bogatyr, the legendary strongman of Russian folklore. That phrase has followed Paul Anderson for 70 years, and for most of those years, nobody questioned it. He won Olympic gold. He set 9 world records and 18 American records during his amateur career. He performed a backlift that Guinness listed at 6,270 pounds for 3 decades. He did all of it looking like no other athlete on earth. 5'9", north of 350 pounds, with a 24-inch neck, biceps over 24 inches, a 58-inch chest, and 36-inch thighs. The New Yorker wrote that he is never mistaken for anyone else. One Iron Game history contributor described him with barely concealed awe, hips like a quarter horse. But there's a question that keeps surfacing among people who care deeply about strength history. Anderson's era overlapped with the arrival of anabolic steroids in American weightlifting. Bob Hoffman's athletes at York Barbell were getting Dianabol. The Soviets were juicing. The whole sport was shifting under everyone's feet. Was Paul Anderson really natural? That question deserves an honest answer built from documented evidence, not assertion in either direction. At the 1956 Senior Nationals in Philadelphia, Anderson posted his all-time highest amateur total, a 400-pound press, a 335-pound snatch, and a 440-pound clean and jerk for a combined 1,175 pounds. These lifts were performed under the old no-contact rules. The bar couldn't touch the athlete's body at any point during the pulling phase of the snatch or the clean. From 1964 onward, a thigh brush was permitted. By 1969, a full hip bump was legal. Anderson had none of that. Every pound went overhead on raw pulling power and pressing strength, with daylight between the bar and his torso. He was the first lifter to total over 1,100 pounds, the first to clean and press over 400. At age 20, on July 25, 1953, in Norfolk, Virginia, he squatted 762 pounds. By 22, his training squat had reached 930 pounds. He bench pressed 450 for 3 reps in an exhibition at the Fry Institute in Chattanooga. At the 1955 Senior Nationals in Cleveland, he set new American records in the clean and jerk at 436.5 pounds and total at 1,145 pounds. Exceeding Norbert Szymanski's previous American record total by 20 pounds. These numbers weren't produced by a man with a team of coaches and a periodization spreadsheet and a nutritional protocol designed in a lab. They were produced by a kid training in a bedroom in rural Georgia. Anderson's father had built him his first weights, concrete poured into wooden forms. When the family moved to Elizabethton, Tennessee, Anderson met Bob Peoples, the 42-year-old farmer who held the official deadlift record at 725 pounds at a body weight of 189. Peoples invited Anderson to train in his makeshift basement gym. During their first session, Peoples asked Anderson for his warm-up weight on the squat. Anderson said 550 pounds. Then he did 2 reps. Peoples took photographs and mailed them to Iron Man and Strength and Health magazines. He knew he was looking at a prodigy. But Anderson's real training happened at home. A Russian journalist who visited his setup before the 1955 Moscow competition marveled at the fact that Paul trained right in his own bedroom, where he had fitted a platform and equipped a small sports hall. The Georgia State University digital collection includes a photograph captioned, "Weightlifter Paul Anderson training in his home gym, 1955. Location depicted, Toccoa, Georgia, Stevens County." His equipment consisted of concrete blocks, truck axles, wagon wheels, oil drums filled with cement, and a safe packed with concrete weighing 2,480 pounds. His training methods were as unconventional as his equipment. Anderson dug a hole in the ground and squatted with a barbell laid across the top. Each week, he'd shovel a little dirt back in, raising the starting point and forcing his body to handle heavier loads from progressively higher positions. He wasn't avoiding full range of motion. He was overloading the top end of the movement to build strength beyond what a standard squat rack could provide. That method is still taught today. Westside Barbell calls it the Anderson squat and programs it as a staple movement for competitive powerlifters. He also used 55-gallon drums filled with concrete, progressively adding material to increase the load. Video evidence exists of Anderson squatting 2 of these barrels. His progressive overload wasn't theoretical, it was industrial. When a barrel got too light, he mixed more cement. And despite weighing over 350 pounds, Anderson performed handstand push-ups. Multiple training sources confirm this. Ross Training specifically cited Anderson as proof that heavyweight athletes had no excuse to skip the exercise. If 350-pound Paul Anderson, who could press a 300-pound dumbbell, found it in his body to do handstand push-ups, then so should you. At a body weight where most men struggle to climb stairs quickly, Anderson was inverting himself and pressing his entire mass overhead with his arms. His dietary approach was equally his own. He consumed 6 or 7 quarts of milk per day. He rested 10 to 30 minutes between sets and up to an hour between exercises. His training partner was Bob Peoples' basement and, later, his own backyard. There was no York Barbell Training Hall, no team of spotters, no coaching staff. There was Anderson, concrete, and gravity. Then there's the backlift. On June 12, 1957, at his home in Toccoa, Anderson raised 6,270 pounds off trestles using his back and legs. The 1985 edition of the Guinness Book of World Records listed it as the greatest weight ever raised by a human being. That entry stood for 30 years. The conditions weren't conducted under modern verification standards. Some historians note the heaviest properly verified backlift was 5,340 pounds, and Guinness eventually removed it. The feat has never been replicated or approached by any human being on any substance under any conditions. Those are the numbers that make the natty question matter. If Anderson did this clean, he may be the most gifted strength athlete in recorded history. If he didn't, it reshapes the entire golden age of American weightlifting. The specific claim that circulates most persistently goes like this. Anderson was using D-Bowl. All of Hoffman's boys got it. 2 embedded assertions. First, that Diana Ball was available during Anderson's peak. Second, that Anderson was one of Hoffman's boys, meaning he was inside the York barbell ecosystem, where those drugs were distributed. Both are testable. The origin story begins on the evening of October 7th, 1954, in Vienna, Austria, at the World Weightlifting Championships. Dr. John Bosley Ziegler, a physician from Olney, Maryland, known in strength circles as Montana Jack, was serving as doctor to the U.S. weightlifting team. Over drinks that evening, a Soviet counterpart made an admission. Sources differ on whether this man was a doctor or a physicist, but the substance of the conversation is corroborated across multiple academic sources. John Fair's research, published through the Stark Center, Terry Todd's work in the Journal of Sport History, John Hoberman and Charles Yesselis in Scientific American, and Taylor and Francis's published sports medicine literature. The Soviet told Ziegler, when Ziegler asked what the Russians were giving their athletes, that his own lifters were being given testosterone. Ziegler already suspected something. Soviet weightlifters had dominated the 1952 Helsinki Olympics, taking gold in multiple weight classes, and their gains looked unnatural. By 1952, Soviet lifters were using synthetic testosterone to build muscle. Now Ziegler had confirmation from inside the program. He returned to the United States and began his own experiments. By the summer of 1954, Ziegler was administering injectable testosterone to 3 York barbell lifters, John Grimmick, Jim Park, and Yaz Kuzahara. All 3 gained measurable strength and weight, but experienced side effects. Grimmick was one of bodybuilding's earliest stars, a man whose physique had defined the sport for a generation. Now he was experimenting with hormones in a doctor's office in Maryland. This was raw injectable testosterone, not an oral steroid. Not a pill you could slip into a bottle of vitamins. Dianabol didn't yet exist. Methandrostenolone, the compound that would become Dianabol, was first described and synthesized in 1955 by Ciba Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland. In 1956, the compound was developed further and given the trade name Dianabol. Ciba filed for a U.S. patent in 1957. The FDA approved Dianabol for commercial medical use in 1958, initially prescribed for burn victims and the elderly. The first documented distribution of Dianabol to York barbell athletes occurred in 1959. Ziegler administered the pills to U.S. weightlifting champion Bill March. 2 other York lifters were confirmed recipients, Tony Garcia and Lou Reekie. Lou Reekie began doing isometric contraction and taking methandrostenolone. Both Garcia and Reekie themselves stated that Dianabol wasn't available from Ciba until 1958. The athlete's own testimony corroborates the FDA timeline. Ziegler initially prescribed small doses. The results were dramatic enough that Hoffman began publicly attributing his athletes' sudden gains to a new training regimen called isometric contraction, rather than admitting the truth. The question of whether the strength gains of strength athletes were attributable to isometrics or steroids became a live controversy at York, one that Hoffman tried to manage through his magazine, Strength and Health, which he published for 54 years. Court documents from the case of Hoffman versus Washington Post Company would later reference that many of his athletes were on anabolic steroids. By 1960, Ziegler had given Dianabol to the entire U.S. Olympic weightlifting team at the Rome Games. The Soviets still took 5 of 7 possible gold medals. The Americans took 1. From that point forward, Dianabol was part of the U.S. program. York Barbell was the center of this pipeline. Bob Hoffman had founded the company in 1932 in York, Pennsylvania. He coached the American Olympic weightlifting team from 1936 to 1968. The York Barbell Club was described as Muscletown, USA, the centralized hub where America's strongest men trained, lived, and competed. Ziegler, based in nearby Olney, Maryland, regularly visited the York facility to administer drugs to the lifters. The pipeline ran from Ziegler's medical practice through Hoffman's gym and out onto the Olympic platform. Anderson's career mapped against that timeline tells a specific story. Anderson won his Olympic gold medal in Melbourne on November 26, 1956, 2 full years before Dianabol received FDA approval, 3 years before the first confirmed distribution to any York lifter. His world championship in Munich was 1955. His record-breaking performance in Moscow was June 15, 1955. His squat records of 714 and 762 pounds were set in 1953, when he was 20 years old. In 1953, the American steroid program hadn't started. Ziegler hadn't attended the Vienna Championships yet. The conversation with the Soviet doctor or physicist was still a year and a half away. After Melbourne, Anderson turned professional. He was specifically barred from the 1960 Rome Olympics because of his professional status. He wasn't in the room when Ziegler handed pills to the entire U.S. team. The Melbourne competition itself deserves closer examination because it shows what Anderson was capable of under the worst possible conditions. He arrived in Australia running a 104-degree fever. The super heavyweight competition stretched into a long, grueling contest against Argentina's Humberto Salvetti. Anderson pressed 167.5 kilograms, well below his world record of 182.5. The fever was eating him alive. Salvetti pressed 175 and held a 7.5 kilogram lead. Both men snatched 145 kilograms. Everything came down to the clean and jerk. Salvetti jerked 170, then 180, then failed at 185. Anderson, who held a world record of 196.5 in the clean and jerk, started at 187.5, the weight that would tie the total. He failed his first attempt. He failed his second. The gold medal was slipping away from a man who, healthy, would have crushed the field by 40 kilograms. On his third and final attempt, Anderson made the lift. The total tied at 500 kilograms. He won gold on the bodyweight tiebreaker. Anderson weighed 137.9 kilograms. Salvetti weighed 143.5. Anderson won the Olympic championship by being the lighter man, the only time in his career that being lighter than someone worked in his favor. He'd taken the 1955 World Championships by 37.5 kilograms. In Melbourne, sick and barely functional, he won by the thinnest margin imaginable. Both performances, the blowout and the survival, happened before Dianabol existed. The Dianabol argument collapses on the documented timeline. But the conversation doesn't end entirely, because Dianabol wasn't the only substance in play. Injectable testosterone was being administered to York lifters from the summer of 1954 onward. Anderson visited York in 1953 to make his case for the U.S. team. He contacted Bob Hoffman directly. Hoffman recognized his talent. Paul Anderson, Hoffman told Strength and Health readers, is our only sure winner. Before the 1955 Soviet tour, Lou DeMarco recounted Anderson training briefly at the York gym while preparing for departure. Anderson wasn't a total stranger to the York ecosystem. He was on the U.S. team. He was known to Hoffman. He set foot in the facility. This is where the skeptic's argument has its strongest foothold. Not in Dianabol, which didn't exist during his peak, but in the possibility that injectable testosterone could have reached him through the York connection during 1954 or 1955. The evidence on Anderson's actual physical location during those years tells a different story. Anderson trained in Toccoa, Georgia. His homemade gym was in his family's property in rural, northeastern Georgia, more than 700 miles from York, Pennsylvania. The Georgia Encyclopedia confirms Toccoa as his base of operations throughout his competitive career. After Melbourne, he returned to Toccoa. He didn't relocate to York. He didn't embed himself in the Hoffman ecosystem. He trained alone, with homemade equipment, in a town small enough that the arrival of a 350-pound man setting world records in his backyard was the most notable thing that had ever happened there. By 1959, when Dianabol was first distributed to March, Garcia, and Ricci at the York facility, Anderson was already a professional strongman. He'd married Glenda Garland that year. He was traveling the country performing exhibitions and building the foundation for what would become the Paul Anderson Youth Home. His competitive weightlifting days were over. He had no organizational reason to be at York receiving anything from Ziegler. He does not appear on any confirmed list of early testosterone or Dianabol recipients. The testosterone recipients in 1954: Grimmick, Park, Kuzahara, all York-based lifters who trained at the facility regularly. The Dianabol recipients from 1959 onward: March, Garcia, Ricci, all York-based. Anderson is absent from both lists. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially in an era with zero drug testing and no formal records of who received what. The first Olympic testing for anabolic steroids didn't occur until the 1976 Montreal Games. The IOC Medical Commission wasn't established until 1967. In Anderson's competitive years, the concept of natural versus enhanced as a meaningful distinction didn't exist. Nobody was checking because nobody had decided there was anything to check for. Anderson couldn't have been caught because there was nothing to catch anyone with. By the same logic, the absence of a failed test proves nothing. But the circumstantial case for his being clean is substantial. He was setting world records at age 20 in 1953, before any American weightlifter is confirmed to have used any performance-enhancing substance. His 762-pound squat at 20 was posted when Ziegler hadn't yet attended the Vienna Championships. If Anderson was somehow accessing testosterone in 1953, he would have been ahead of Ziegler himself. Could injectable testosterone have reached him through a doctor or some channel entirely outside Ziegler's program? Theoretically possible. Injectable testosterone existed and was available medically. There were no regulations preventing a physician from prescribing it for any purpose. But this would require Anderson, a 21-year-old in rural Georgia with no documented connection to any medical PED program, to have independently discovered and pursued testosterone supplementation at a time when even the U.S. Olympic team's own physician didn't know the Soviets were using it. The weight of the documented evidence, the timeline, the geography, the confirmed recipient lists, the pre-steroid records at age 20, falls heavily on the side of Anderson being exactly what the Russians called him, chudo prirodi. Anderson's physique itself has become an object of fascination, particularly his neck. In 1956, his measurements were recorded. That 24-inch neck, the 58-inch chest, the 36-inch thighs, all packed onto a frame under 5'10". This wasn't a bodybuilder's physique. There was no aesthetic tapering, no visible separation between muscle groups, no attempt to look good by the standards of physique competition. Anderson was blocky, dense, and uniform, built like something designed to support weight from every angle. His build anticipated the modern super heavyweight powerlifter by decades, before the sport of powerlifting formally existed. A 24-inch neck on a man under 5'10" is a structural anomaly. The traps, the sternocleidomastoid, the deep cervical musculature, all of it fused into a column that made his head appear to emerge directly from his shoulders. Whether this physique is consistent with natural status is a question endocrinologists can debate. But the honest answer is that Anderson's proportions were so far outside any normal distribution, natural or enhanced, that drawing conclusions from appearance alone is speculative in either direction. Many enhanced athletes look nothing like him. No amount of any substance produces a 24-inch neck without the underlying genetic architecture to support it. What the physique does tell us is that Anderson's body had adapted over years of the most extreme progressive overload imaginable to one purpose: moving the heaviest possible loads. Every tissue, every joint, every muscular attachment point reflected that singular adaptation. His high school coach had tried to dissuade him from lifting, warning that it would make him muscle-bound. Anderson ignored the advice and became the strongest human being anyone had ever measured. The story that circulated for decades, Anderson ripping a car door off its hinges in Atlanta in 1973, has been passed down through community memory rather than documented journalism. No newspaper account or first-hand written record has surfaced to verify the specific details. But the story persists because it sits comfortably within the documented reality of what Anderson's body could do. This was a man who cleaned 424 pounds and pressed it overhead twice as a guest lifter at Madison Square Garden in 1958, barely missing a third rep, while the audience sat in stunned silence. At a hotel afterward, Soviet world champion Arkady Vorobyev, the 198-pound class champion, unwisely grabbed Anderson by his enormous neck and attempted to choke him. Anderson drove Vorobyev into a wall and knocked him senseless. That incident is documented in the Stark Center's archives. His professional career was a relentless series of these displays. In 1957, he began a 2-week engagement at the Mapes Hotel and Casino in Reno, squatting a thick bar connecting 2 transparent receptacles filled with silver dollars. Total weight reportedly between 900 and 1,160 pounds. He did 2 performances a day, 3 on Sundays. A $15,000 prize was offered to anyone who could duplicate the squat. Nobody collected. The act was broadcast on The Ed Sullivan Show to more than 40 million viewers. At a 1966 exhibition in Denver, Anderson showed up with a severely sprained right ankle, his lower leg terribly swollen. For his warm-up, he skipped rope to fast music. When asked what weight he wanted for his first squat, he replied, "Put on anything over the world's record." Bill Pearl, who witnessed the exhibition, described it in his book Legends of the Iron Game. After Pearl finished his posing routine, Anderson appeared on stage, stripped to the waist, vocally challenging Pearl to a pose down. Both received standing ovations. In Silver Spring, Maryland, in 1965, Anderson drove 700 miles in 15 hours to reach a meet, then cleaned and pressed 420 pounds, squatted 900, and deadlifted 710. The coach of the Silver Spring Barbell Club, Glenn McDevitt, documented the evening. Anderson performed at this level routinely, under conditions of fatigue, poor nutrition, and inconsistent training, because by then, keeping the youth home open mattered more than any number on a barbell. In 1961, Paul and Glenda Anderson founded the Paul Anderson Youth Home in Vidalia, Georgia. They'd visited detention facilities for troubled youth and been moved to ACT. The home took in young people between 16 and 21 who had nowhere else to go. It sat in a grove of pecan trees with a swimming pool, stables for horses, wholesome food, and a weight room. To keep it funded, Anderson made up to 500 speaking engagements and strength exhibitions per year. 500. He'd drive to a small town, hammer a nail with his bare fist, raise a table loaded with 8 men onto his back, speak about his faith, and drive to the next town. This was the post-competition career that theoretically overlapped with Diana Ball's commercial availability. Anderson was using whatever strength remained in his deteriorating body to keep a home for troubled teenagers operational. He was inducted into the Fellowship of Christian Athletes Hall of Champions in 1992. He used this platform to minister to athletes and coaches around the world. His autobiography was titled A Greater Strength, and the title didn't refer to what he could lift. In 1983, Anderson suffered total renal failure. The kidney disease he'd carried since childhood, Bright's disease, diagnosed when he was 4 or 5 years old, finally overwhelmed his system. His older sister donated a kidney. He regained some function, but both hips were replaced in 1986, and he spent most of his remaining years in a wheelchair. The same kidneys that had been compromised since before he could remember, the same condition that had nearly killed him as a small child, ground him down over decades while he kept lifting, kept touring, kept funding the youth home with his body. Paul Anderson died on August 15, 1994, in Vidalia, Georgia. He was 61 years old. He was named the strongest man of the century at the USA Power and Strength Symposium in 1992. The Paul Anderson Youth Home continues to operate. Here is what the documented record supports after tracing every thread the evidence offers. The specific claim that Anderson used Dianabol does not survive contact with the timeline. The drug was synthesized in 1955, named in 1956, patented in 1957, FDA approved in 1958, and first distributed to York athletes in 1959. Anderson won his Olympic gold in 1956. His world records were set in 1953 and 1955. He wasn't at the 1960 Rome Olympics, where the entire U.S. team received the drug. He'd already left amateur weightlifting behind before the first York athlete swallowed the first pink pill. The broader claim, that injectable testosterone might have reached him through the York connection, is harder to eliminate entirely. Testosterone was in the York ecosystem from the summer of 1954 onward. Anderson was loosely associated with that ecosystem. No drug testing existed. But Anderson trained 700 miles away in Toccoa, Georgia. He is named on no confirmed recipient list. He was posting world records before the American steroid program began. His 762-pound squat at age 20 in 1953 predates Ziegler's Vienna revelation by over a year. The weight of the evidence, the timeline, the geography, the confirmed recipient lists, the pre-steroid records, the organizational distance from York, falls on the side of Anderson being what the Russians called him in the Moscow Rain in 1955. Chudo prirodi, a wonder of nature. But even if someone could produce documents that don't exist and tests that were never conducted to prove that Paul Anderson once took a substance that wasn't banned, wasn't tested for, and wasn't considered cheating by any authority alive at the time, it wouldn't change the thing that actually matters about his life. He took the strongest body ever recorded and spent it carrying other people's kids. He drove 1,000,000 miles across America to gymnasiums and church basements so that teenagers with nothing would have something. He did this while his kidneys were failing, while his hips were disintegrating, while every exhibition took more out of a body that had been compromised since childhood.
The numbers on the barbell are staggering. The 1,175-pound total under no contact rules. The 6,270-pound backlift, listed by Guinness for 30 years as the greatest weight ever raised by a human being. The 402-pound press in the Moscow rain, while 15,000 skeptics stopped laughing and stood up. The number that stands untouched is 500. Exhibitions per year, year after year, to keep the youth home alive. No one has matched that lift. No substance produces it. We won't see his like again. This video was made entirely without AI. All sources, including the Stark Center Archives, the Journal of Sport History, ESPN's Outside the Lines investigation, and the Paul Anderson Youth Home, are linked in the description. Subscribe for more stories told with this level of care.